I guess that's probably the biggest question I got, right? I mean, is every prostitute or escort trafficked?
So 85% of people involved in commercial sex are actually under third-party control. I know every day at the end of the day she goes back to somebody, and I'm looking at videos of her engaged in sexual acts with a male. I'm looking at, her going back every day. I'm looking at videos of her being engaged in sex acts. And I've got like 3 dudes that are pretty consistent across social media. Like, who is it? That's easy. When we look at others, if I
can. Leaders are not born in a womb. They are forged through heat, pressure, and a whole lot of sweat. The Fire Forged Leader podcast serves the audience through exploring leadership at work, in the community, and with the family, using a practical perspective and real-life experiences from the host, Steve Baumgartner, and his guests in The Forge. Now, it's time to enter the Forge with the Fire Forged Leader.
I'd like to welcome everybody back to the Fire Forged Leader podcast. Today we have Joe Scaramucci. I hope I said that right.
Right on the money.
Sweet. I keep on going back and forth in between the long A and the hard A. So
yeah, no, you got it.
Anyways, Joe is currently with Skull Games, but just recently retired from being a detective down in McLennan, McLennan County, down in Texas, and now is the director of law enforcement engagement for Skull Games. So now that I butchered all that, tell us what you really do, Joe.
Yeah, you got the name right and the job wrong, right? Or the county wrong. Yeah, so I just left right at 20 years of law enforcement. Just my quick history. Obviously did my time on patrol out on the street. Back around early 2008, I shifted into investigations. At the time I was working death and sex crimes. So did about 7 years worth of, whether it be 80-year-old grandma falling asleep and not waking up, or somebody that decided to take another human's life. Did that for about 7 years, sex crimes as well. Right at 13 years of SWAT, both as entry and as a sniper, and then about 12 years of our aviation unit as well. Started doing trafficking kind of by accident back in 2014, and I say trafficking was more like child exploitation type stuff. Really had no idea what we were doing, just kind of asked on a whim, hey, can we get online and pose as kids? And obviously got the blessing of administration. It worked. We were pretty successful at it. It just evolved over the years. We started looking back then, Backpage was around. So, we were like, hey, let me pose as a trafficker on Backpage, right? And I'll sell off, quote, kids. It's amazing how many men you would talk to and be like, hey, look, like I am the pimp and this is a kid. And they're still just like, hey, let me open my wallet and hand you the money. And then from there, it kind of evolved. We started looking, hey, real live victims are on here. Let's quit posing as victims and start finding them. Unfortunately, we kind of led to doing some of the law enforcement norms, but broke off from that pretty quick and kind of started pushing the envelope elsewhere, which kind of really became a pretty solid model to move forward on trafficking cases.
Yeah, so in 2014, you were basically just spun up and let's go out and try and find these.
2014 was that, and all the stupidity that came with it, right? That was, hey, I want to go out and just try to find these guys trying to have sex with kids. I had no idea what we were doing, no idea. I actually blew a case one time because the guy kept asking me what I wanted to drink alcohol-wise, and I was trying to think what a 15-year-old girl drinks. And all I could think of was when I was 15, right? And I'm like, Zima. And the guy told me, no, you're a cop. And I'm like, no, I'm not. And he goes, yeah, you are. They don't make Zima anymore. I'm like, oh, you got to be kidding me. So I should have been whatever I could get my hands on, right? But yeah, we were doing that. So we were both working trafficking investigations, child exploitation investigations. Very early, I had some very large scale cases. And they just started taking a lot of time. So it finally got to the point where I had to either go to administration and say, hey, look, this is a full-time gig or I can't do it anymore. And they moved me to full-time.
So what got you to start doing it in the first place?
Oh, this is going to sound horrible. I thought I'll never forget. I'm driving to the gym with my partner at lunch. I think we had just cleared like a death scene. And I was like, dude, have you seen that show, like To Catch a Predator? And he's like, yeah. And I said, how funny would that be to watch these dudes' faces when they show up thinking they're going to be, having sex with a young teen. And it's us. And that's literally how it started. I wish it were for some noble cause that I could be like, oh, well, it touched my heart to watch this documentary or whatever. But no, it was before that was even cool.
I am glad that I didn't say what I was going to say before and say that it can't be as bad as the Zima comment, but you did.
Yeah, no, I blow an entire case off a bottle of Zima. Like, how did I know this stuff? I didn't even drink it. Like, how did I know this was no longer around?
That's an awesome story. I'm never going to forget that one. So there's no doubt that you have passion for it today.
Yeah, for sure.
There is no doubt. So I guess I'm really curious on how that grew. You guys kind of started it on you see the show and what would it be like, but what really struck your heart chords to get you to have a lifelong career in it?
Yeah. A few different things. One thing I enjoyed about working a homicide was that I got to speak for somebody that's never going to be able to speak again. Right. So I got to kind of speak on their behalf. I think a couple of things when it came to this. One was as I started looking, I was like, I get to tell a story now for somebody who's still alive. So there's still hopefully, more to the story than what there has been. Whereas working death investigations, the story's done when it's done, I very early, thankfully, had a young lady reach out to me on Facebook and send me a very lengthy message about how I quote saved her, and whatever, which was pretty motivating, at the time to be like, hey, we got to keep pushing. Beyond that, I think, and I don't say this negatively, but you have people that are in a really, really rough spot in their life, and being able to be there with them in that and see them through that, even if it's just from the sidelines, like, hey, what can I do? I can't tell you how many people I've come in contact with that the what can I do is not, I need money, I need this, I need that, I need to go here, I need to go there. It's literally like, can you pray for me? I'm graduating high school. Can you come to the ceremonies? Things like that you don't really consider that really have been the driving force for me, I think, when I look at it. The other thing too is I actually had somebody recently ask me, what do you want to be known for the most? And it was like, for the things that nobody knows about. And she was like, that doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, it does to me, right? Like, I want to be there for people that need it, and just be there. Nobody has to know.
I can't think of a better reason, Joe. That's amazing. I often think about when I'm making big decisions, what I want printed on my headstone, right?
Yeah.
Dad was a great guy, but he drank too much alcohol. No, that doesn't look good, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a perfect thing to have on your headstone, right? Is to be known for the things that nobody knows about.
Yeah. I mean, I never thought of it that way. Maybe it'll end up there.
I think it's a good motivator, right? And
yeah, for sure.
Your mission all the way around is very noble, right? You're not doing it for the paycheck. You're not doing it for a lot of different things. You're doing it because you want to make an impact and you want to be there for people at their core. So I commend you for that, sir.
Thank you.
So as I've been talking, and I am very much a noob in this entire sector. So some things are probably very, very evident to people like you who have been working at it for a long time. But for me, I think about all these things after I get done talking to someone. And one of them is I've noticed that there's this switch in law enforcement that has changed over time from blaming the victim, right? Taking them to jail, to the switch to hunting for the predator. So what did that look like over time?
And, I wish I could say we were better than what we are, but we're not. We're failing miserably. It's been a push. It's been a very uphill battle. One thing about cops, we've all got egos. I don't know if you know that or not, but
Never noticed.
I mean, is the shift there? Yes, thankfully. And there are some agencies that are just embracing it, and it's wonderful, and it's as good as it gets. There are some that are absolutely heinous and horrible and treat these women like absolute trash. And frankly, in most situations, they should probably be the ones in jail versus the women. It's finding the key players that I think is the biggest thing. If you find the right person, and again, it goes back to leadership versus management, right? I'm not talking about finding the person at the top. I'm talking about finding the right person. And when you can get that person involved, everybody else will follow, whether it be up, above, or below. The other thing we like to do is, as cops, and I'll tell on ourselves a little bit, is talk out both sides of our mouth. I don't arrest women for prostitution, but I arrest them for manifestation because they're here, right? Like, come on. I don't arrest women for prostitution, but she does have a warrant for parking 20 feet from a fire hydrant 18 years ago. She's going to jail, so that I can stat this arrest, right? It's tick marks. It's the bean counters at the top that are generally the problem. But that shift that we're seeing, I think, as it continues to grow momentum and as it continues to swing that pendulum and show people, hey, this actually works via numbers, via, as much as I hate to say this, the old breed of law enforcement being retired. As those start to shift out, I think we'll see a lot more change. I think that pendulum is at like the 80 or the 48%, right? We just got to get over that hump to 52%. It's gonna go full blast, I think.
Yeah, I also want to talk about the other side, just looking at it from the outside in, right? The stories that I've been hearing, there are women who are grossly abducted and forced against their will and things like that. But that's not the majority of people that I'm seeing anyways.
No, I think when they talk about kidnapping in the U.S. resulting in trafficking, it's something like less than 0.1%. Like it's a fraction. Yet it's what everybody focuses on.
Oh, of course, because it's what we saw in Taken, right? And
yeah, for sure.
And the other movie that just came out here recently.
Maybe started.
But when we look at it from that lens, there's all these women who, I watched an interview with you talking about skull games, and that's really what it is they get inside of these women's heads. And when you look at it from that aspect, when you're an officer out there, it's got to be very hard to determine whether this person is doing it by choice, because I'm sure there are those people, and then the people who are, on the fraud or coercion side of trafficking.
Yeah, so it's actually not that difficult, right? And that's where I get kind of been out of shape. One thing that I train is you should never send a text message before you know the story, right? So as an investigator doing a sting, I should never send a text that's just cold. Like, hey, how you doing? That's usually what happens. Law enforcement's getting on these certain websites and they're like, hey, all the way down the line till they get a response. They get a response. Girl shows up. They try to flip her like they do dope, and it just doesn't work, right? when we actually build targeting, when we actually target and we build a targeting packet against a trafficker, 9 out of 10 times I can say that we've been right. 9 out of 10 times, by the time the trafficker, there's even times I have warrants before we even send a text message, for alternative charges, money laundering, promotion of prostitution, things like that. It's not that difficult. It's just taking the time to do it. And that's where, again, it goes back to bean counters and the people that are statting everything. Because if we go do an operation, right, we'll say a 2-day operation. If I was to say in 2 days we'll pick Killeen, Texas, right? It's busy there. You really should have no more than 5 victim recoveries, probably 2 or 3 trafficker arrests and a few buyer arrests. That's it. So all these like large numbers, it's all nonsense. It's garbage. But it keeps the people at the top happy, right? Because they're out making arrests, whatever. The smaller the number, the better the quality.
So when you're sending those text messages, though, what you're saying is you've already done the background work on looking at that person and figuring out that they have a person in the middle that's actually selling them. Mm-hmm. Is that what I understood?
Yeah. 9 out of 10 times I already know who you are beforehand. The other like 1, I may be like, I don't know who he is, but I know he exists, right? I know he's there. I just don't know who he is. Once I can get her to me, then I'll find out who he is. That's not a problem. It's just getting to that point sometimes of, in skull games and in a lot of the other operations I do, people are like, well, I can't identify the trafficker. That's fine. You know he exists. So if you know he exists, we can identify it later. That's no big deal. Just getting that through.
So how do you know he exists? I guess that's probably the biggest question I got, right? I mean, is every prostitute or escort trafficked?
No, statistically though, I think we're running about 85% are, right? So 85% of people involved in commercial sex are actually under third-party control. So what I tell people is, especially law enforcement, walk in with the belief that person's being trafficked, because pick out the 1.5 that's not, right? Like I'll bet a paycheck on this one. So, we treat everybody as though they are being trafficked. If they're not, fine. Worst case scenario, at the end of the day, they're treated like a decent human being and maybe get some services that can help them, right? Like, who cares? That one of 10, even if it was 3 of 10, who cares? But a lot of it just goes back to indicators. It goes back to what we can find on the internet, right? What's open source? What tools do I have at my expense that I can use? And there's some pretty high-speed tools that we can use to be like, I don't know who this is. I just know at the end of the day, every day she goes back to somebody. I know every day at the end of the day, she goes back to somebody, and I'm looking at videos of her engaged in sexual acts with a male. I'm looking at, her going back every day. I'm looking at videos of her being engaged in sex acts. And I've got like 3 dudes that are pretty consistent across social media. Like, who is it? That's easy. When we look at others, if I can pin down where your money's going, it's going back to the trafficker at the end of the day. So if I'm steadily watching money go to, Dizzy Whizzle every day, I pretty much know who the trafficker is, right? And from there, it's super, super easy.
So that's interesting that you're actually watching money flow or something like that and using open source type things to do that. And that's
and it's
really
a mix. It's obviously a mix of law enforcement databases and open source. So it's not like you're not going to Google people's wire transfers, right?
Right. But a lot of that stuff you also have to get warrants for before you even touch it, don't you?
No, on those, depending on which tool we use, completely free, completely simple, sit at your desk and do it. Doesn't even require subpoenas or search warrants. Now, granted, some of it does, don't get me wrong, but some of it doesn't.
Wow. So you made my ears really perk up, because I'm really big on the dignity topic. And I love what you said there. At the end of the day, you just treat people well, right? And get them the services that they need. I had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day in this topic that, I don't know what it is in school, but, 3rd or 4th grade, when you have career day, there's no girl in that classroom, no boy either, right, that stands there and says, I want to be a prostitute or a porn star when I grow up, right?
Yep.
That's not the dreams that these people have.
No, not at all.
So the dignity thing, right? I mean, it really has to be at the forefront of everybody's minds. We got to stop looking at these people if we see them out on the street or seeing them, do this, that, or the other. They got there through a series of either one decision led into two or what have you. But at the end of the day, they're still people with dignity.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got up on a soapbox there.
No, you're right. I mean, and that's, when my kid's 17 now, but when he was young, when I travel, I take him with me when he's, available to, or if I'm not like in an op where he just can't be there. And I remember we're in Philly one time and there was all these, I've always been big on give to people who need it. And there was a guy who was very clearly on narcotics, he was clearly on heroin. And, my kid, he was probably 9, 10, maybe at the time. And I said, hey, take care of this guy. And he was like, why? He's on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to spend the money on drugs. And I was like, how do you know that? He said, well, because that's what people do. And I said, well, how do you know that money's going to drugs? And he said, well, I don't. And I said, exactly. What if it's going to go to pizza inside this place? And it even brought it a very interesting topic, because my question then was, what if he does go buy heroin with it? He's like, well, that's bad. I'm like, yeah, but what if it keeps him alive tonight so that tomorrow he can get help? And then it's like that,
wow.
that head spinning, of like, what's right, what's wrong, I don't know. And in a lot of ways, I blame law enforcement for this. 20 years ago in Police Academy Day 1, you're taught us and them, us and them, us and them. And everybody's out to kill you. I've been shot at a handful of times. I've had to talk my way out of way more than what I've, what I mean? Like, what are we talking about, us versus them? Like, we're all in this shit show together. So
right,
let's figure it out. It's tough.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I've never thought about it from that aspect. Maybe it keeps him alive. Maybe he doesn't put the gun in his mouth tonight because he's got the drug, or, whatever the case may be. Right. But at the end of the day too, that's a lot of judgment we're putting in our own hands. Right.
For sure.
I mean, looking at it from a Christian perspective,
don't get me started there. Yeah.
That's exactly the wrong way, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Now, we'll be judged, on how we react to that person in need, right?
Yeah.
And they'll be judged on how they react to what they ask for. It's as simple as that for me, basing it off from a Christian stance. But
yeah, same.
Man, I'm really going to have to think about that, staying alive for one more day thing. I mean, that's a darn good question. So how'd your son react to all that?
He and I have always had a pretty good relationship when it comes to service to others. So, at a very young age, I was having him do things that, I had very good parents, don't get me wrong, but things that my parents never made me do. Like, it's something simple. Like I hate bringing up some of it, but things like that, like, hey, go take care of this guy. Why? Well, because he's a freaking human being. That's why. He doesn't have this means, you have it, go take care of it. And, hopefully it sticks. I think it has. He's, like I said, he's 17. He still goes out of his way to do things for other people. And hopefully that stays the same way. But yeah, I just think there's too much division and we're too worried, like you said, being judgmental. There's an old country song. I can't remember the name of what it is, but the guy talks about being homeless and he talks about how somebody crossed the yellow line, killed his wife and kid. That's the day he went crazy. That's the day everything began. Right. And you don't know that that's not what happened to this person. Like I used to, when I would teach at the police academy, I'd tell young cops, don't start this us and them shit, because you're one split-second decision from being them. One split-second decision whether it be I think I'm good to drive, whether it be I got a little too pissed off, my hands went places they shouldn't have gone with my wife, whatever the case may be, you're one split second decision away. So we got to quit with that.
Oh, I agree. And in all society, it's not just law enforcement, right? So I'm going to tell you a little story here today, Joe. When I was 22 years old, I was looking at quite a few years in the pen. I was a meth addict. There was times I lived out on the street. I was married to someone totally different than my wife today. But I was also carrying around a lot of baggage, from things that, my biological father did to me and different things like that, right? That I believe led me into that. I never dealt with the emotions, all that led me there. But the only difference in between, I had an employee who didn't want to hire someone because they were a felon. So I told him this story right here. The only reason that I'm not a felon is because I said the right things in the courtroom that day, and I had a pretty good lawyer. That was it.
Yeah.
And once again, split decisions, right? So it's for everybody listening, right? We got to stop judging people, because I wouldn't be sitting here right now if that decision hadn't been made.
Yeah, I can tell you the same. I'm not going to get into details, but I can tell you the same.
Agreed. So something, just talking to different people along the line, this may be true, maybe not, but I've heard that you're known for helping these women to work through and get charges removed and things like that. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, it's a true statement. Charges, I've offered to be a defense witness as an expert. I have. I've worked through that, trying to get them housing, whether it be letters saying that had this happened in our jurisdiction, they would not have gone to jail or whatever. But yeah, I've definitely worked on that.
That's awesome. I mean, you go back to the drugs and everything else, and a lot of these women, get trapped up in that, either to deal with the pain while they're in it, or, the pain that they were struggling with before. So,
yeah,
just having someone be on their side for a change is amazing, right?
Yeah, it's been growing for me though too, right? It's funny because people always talk about that and stuff like that, and I'm like, it's more selfish for me. At least it feels that way. I have a good friend of mine that, we were having beers one night. We were both presenting, and I was like, she was a previous bottom, and I asked her, I was like, did you ever think you would be hanging out having beers with a cop? And she's like, did you ever think you'd be hanging out having beers with a bottom? And I was like, no. No, I'm not gonna lie, no. And she's like, yeah, me either. But it's been interesting because I think, and Jeff Teagues has brought this up a couple times, but when you look at traumas of survivors, right, and military and law enforcement, all that, they're different, but they're the same. What I've endured is completely different than what a trafficking survivor has. I'm not even comparing the two, but it's acknowledged trauma, and it's acknowledged trauma with each other. So being able to have that empathy of, do I know what it's like to not have housing because I have a prior prostitution arrest? No, I don't. Can I help you fix that problem? I damn sure hope so. So that's, again, it's always felt kind of selfish just because I feel like I've got more from it. I have long lasting friendships from those things. I have the sense of being able to make right what we as law enforcement did wrong. That's tough for cops. I mean, most don't want to hear it or even acknowledge it.
No, I get you. It doesn't sound selfish to me at all, though. I didn't hear a bit of selfishness in there, wanting to help another human being, wanting to right wrongs. Those kind of things don't feel selfish, maybe because it's your mission, right?
Yeah, could be.
But I wouldn't look at it as selfish at all. You're helping a lot of people out there. So we started talking about this off camera, but I think people don't realize how big of an issue this is, but you know, I'm sure you don't know the exact numbers, but about how many people have you arrested in this?
It depends on the angle that we're looking at. Honestly, if we're looking at sex buyers, I think, and this is just my personal, but I think that one is topped 670. When you look at the amount of trafficking survivors that I've intersected with, as of yesterday was about 200 and a little over 280. And then traffickers has been about 165 arrests. Child exploitation is probably about 200 arrests. So people trying to have sex with kids. So
my word.
Yeah.
Those numbers are astounding to me. I mean,
I have a very good friend of mine that when people start asking about that, he's like, I've heard him say it. He's like, have you ever seen him sleep? And they're like, no. He's like, I travel with the guy. He's like, I don't know how he how he functions.
Oh, you're good.
He's like, I don't know how this works because all I ever see is him working. Like that's all he does.
Well, and I'm sure that's just skimming the surface too.
Oh yeah, it's 100% skimming the surface. You know,
so I mean, that just you're a sheriff. You had a jurisdiction, right? I mean, you're not going.
I don't know. His big joke has always been, I don't know anything about county lines or state lines. There have been plenty of times I've walked in his office and said, hey, I got a suspect in New York City. I need to fly to Brooklyn. He's like, well, why are you here then? So, I mean, we've literally executed search and arrest warrants all over the country. Been very fortunate to work around the world too. But yeah, in terms of what we have going, if you have anything that touches our county, we don't know what a state line is. We're coming.
Well, that really brings it up a notch, but you're not the only, I don't know, maybe you are. You're not the only person in the world who's, going on this type of a mission in law enforcement. Well, actually, I know I had Heidi Chance on here who was over in Phoenix, right?
Yeah.
And she was on a similar mission, not quite like you do it, but one of her own. And Phoenix definitely had its numbers.
They've got their fair share. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it kind of brings me back to the law enforcement thing. And you talked about training a few times. Is there any sort of good training happening in law enforcement now for trafficking? Is it getting?
It's debatable, right? Yeah. Is there some good training? Absolutely. I'm first to tell you there's some very good training. There's some very good trainers, right? There's some trash. There's a lot of trash. This is not a knock to anybody outside the law enforcement world. But to have somebody come in and be like, let me teach you how to do an investigation that has never actually investigated human trafficking other than from a money laundering perspective, which I love money laundering. That's one of my favorite charges to pull on people because you can't really escape it. But that's like me coming to them and being like, hey, let me tell you how to work Basic Secrecy Act. Like, what are you talking about? This is not my background.
Right.
You run into that a lot. The other we run into is agencies that think they're doing best practices that are not doing best practices. Like I know of an agency, and I'm not going to mention who they are, but there are plenty. You can Google it. But this agency engages in sexual acts with the victims in the name of undercover. And then they go out and teach best practices. Like, on what planet did this just become a best practice? And what in God's name makes you think you should be teaching this to other agents and agencies to run with? So, yeah, very good training. There's some people who have been in this field for a long time that are really doing some good work. As an example, Heidi's one of them. Kevin Metcalf, like you brought up earlier when we were talking, amazing people. Again, there's some really, really good ones. There's some really not good ones, though.
No, I would just hearing you speak about those. I think they should be in cuffs myself.
Oh man, that's been my argument this whole time. Is that's called sexual assault in my book. But
Yeah.
Who am I? But I mean, I went to a training one time that taught you how to choke victims of trafficking, like to maintain them, so that you don't hurt them. And I'm like, when did we start choking victims? Like, on what planet is any of this okay?
No.
You can't make it up. You can't make it up.
That just blows my damn mind, Joe. It blows my mind. Well, let's switch over to the next topic, right?
Okay.
And that's skull games. One of the coolest logos out there today, in my opinion. I see it all over the place. I want to buy one of the geese, but I'm a Gracie Baja member, which we have our own little sect, right? But anyways, skull games. What made you transfer from law enforcement into skull games?
Yeah, so Skull Games used to fall under another organization's umbrella. I've been working with them for years since they were there. Jeff Teagues and I came in contact a few years ago. He's the president and founder. We started bouncing some things off each other, and he was like, "Hey, we got this thing called Skull Games, man. You want to come out for a weekend and check it out?" I'm like, sure. I get real skeptical when people come at me with the whole like, "Oh, I'm former 3-letter, or I'm former, tier 1, whatever." So to have somebody that I actually trusted that was like, "Hey, not even talking about his background, but you're like, okay, I get it." Kind of it lended credibility to me, right? So when I actually went and saw what was going on, I was like, man, this is legit. Like you've got guys that are, former and current military, law enforcement, a guy that was still participates, but has transitioned jobs, was a heavy equipment mechanic, right? It's like, how this guy gets spun up on this, and what I like about Skull Games, there's a few different things, but it's just that everybody comes together, right? There's not this like sit around and talk about how trafficking is bad. We're not going to the local movie theater and telling people that they need to watch The Sound of Freedom so they can understand trafficking, which is BS. But, these are people that are actually volunteering to do the work. And in watching that happen a couple times, I was like, man, this is awesome. Got to go overseas with Jeff and Ty and, the rest of the crew a couple times. Working and training in northern Iraq. And just kind of as those friendships built and Skull Games separated and became its own 501c3 and everything was just kind of falling into place. There had been a joke that I was the international law enforcement liaison because of a weird title that had to be made for something. And we're just talking one day and they're like, "Hey, what a job?" And I was like, "Oh, is it the international law enforcement liaison?" And they're like, "No, but
Close."
Yeah, close. So, it was that simple. It was a phone call. And, I love law enforcement. The beauty was when I went to my sheriff and talked to him about it, he was like, "Hey, I want you to stay on as a reserve. We'll still hold your creds. We'll still, you want to work operations, investigations, go work them." So when that came from him and, the other came from Jeff, it was like, man, this is too easy a choice. It just kind of all worked out. So.
No, that's awesome. So let's tell the listeners what Skull Games really is.
So there's a few different things. So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We've got a few hundred volunteer analysts that help with anything, right? So as an example, if an agency reaches out and they're like, "Hey, we're doing an operation tonight. Can you guys help?" Obviously, we don't like that short of notice, but it happens. Then we'll get some analysts devoted. We've got Michelle Block. She's the director of intelligence, amazing analyst. She will grab some people, whether I'm involved or just, helping out with whatever. And people just start pouring in intel, right? So I'll just use Riverside, California as an example, just because it's off the top of my head. They may reach out and be like, "Hey, we're going to do an operation in 3 days." So for 3 days, we may be plugging them intel. Like, these are the actors, these are the traffickers we're identifying, these are their victims. Or they may be like, "Hey, we're doing one tonight and we need information on this person." So once we get that focal point, then we start churning the intel on that person. That being said, quarterly we have what's called a Skull Games Task Force Weekend. This past 2 weeks ago, it was in New Orleans. We had right at 100 in-person analysts and about 100 online analysts that are all just devoting pumping intel into these operations. So as an example, let me pull the numbers there. The one in New Orleans was roughly 16 hours of work. We identified 61 victims of trafficking, 24 targets, which would be the traffickers, over the course of 11 states. In that one, we were providing live intel led to the possible recovery of a 14-year-old and the trafficker being arrested in the DFW area. So there's a ton of moving parts.
Wow.
A couple of my favorite initiatives, though, that we have. One is for veterans. So you got these guys that are coming out of the military that are like, hey, I left fighting a war and now I'm over here working for Dell computers. Like, I don't have that sense of like fulfillment anymore. Like, I want a mission. We'll train them up, work with them. Boom. They'll be out there hunting traffickers as well. But probably my favorite is we have a survivor and a hunter program. So we take trafficking survivors who are in a good position to do it, that are all in. We train them up on how to do open source, intelligence, work with them, and basically they start hunting traffickers as well. So cool thing with them is we always have at least one survivor per team that's doing the digging, because they're kind of like, I say kind of, they are literally a lived experience expert. So if we have somebody that's rabbit holing, they can come over and be like, no, you're wasting your time right there. Look over here, follow that one, so that's been pretty cool.
So you talked about all these volunteer analysts. What does it take to be an analyst for Skull Games?
Yeah, so if you go online, there's an application on there for it. Things are kind of shifting right now. Basically, what's going to happen is you would have to obviously complete a background check. There's a series of trainings and meetings that lead up to. There's a training that has to be completed before you can really even take step 2. And then from there, there's going to be skills-based tests, right? So if you're eating a soup sandwich, chances are you're going to have to do some more studying, right? But no, I mean, when people are there, what'll happen is they generally get assigned to a team of people with mentors. So it's like, hey, I'm new to this. It's my first time. I've got the skill set, but how do we actually tailor it? And we'll have the mentors that are there with them, survivors, veterans, veteran hunters. And they're really just kind of helping them get their feet wet and walk through, how to do some of these investigations.
Excuse me. Got a little bit of a cold here.
Yeah. No.
Cold and a black eye, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah, there you go.
By the way, I'll never make a soup sandwich again. So you're not really talking about like pure genius data analysts or anything like that. What you're talking about is people with a willingness to learn something new and put it to use.
Yeah, both, right? So there's a mix, because you have, you may have somebody who's literally, and I don't say this negatively, but like a soccer mom from the burbs who's there punching away intel, who is like, I think I have something, but I don't know where to go from here. And then we're able to go, okay, here's this technology, go over here to this person. Here's that technology, go to this person. Here's this person's skill set. Like, I know you're stuck on this, but come over here and help with this. And, really, I mean, going back to like just sheer leadership, being able to exploit other people's talents and use those talents kind of in unity with other people's skill sets. And yeah, there's some high speed, low drag. There's some low speed, high drag. It's all of the above.
Oh yeah, and you need all those kind of people in a team
For sure.
Right? Otherwise, if it was all data analysts, they'd be all nerding out in the corner on this one topic.
No, they'd be there for 4 days trying to figure out what a mass dump is, right? At least these people, we give them start points to begin with, so they have a solid like, okay, here we move forward. But no, we don't have the 400 analysts sitting in a corner eating Cheetos, staring at numbers. Definitely not that.
With the blue light glasses.
Yeah, exactly.
So where do you fit into that? You're the director of law enforcement engagement. So how do you fit into all that?
So, when it comes to the Skull Games task force weekends, or when it comes to, day-to-day operations, I'm always, helping with intel, helping with building, whatever. So if Michelle's, kind of the lone wolf on something, then I'm obviously helping her if I can, or vice versa. Like, we all just kind of help each other out. Part of my role, and the one that I think is the biggest and what I take the most, like, kind of serious, I guess, is vetting of agencies and agents, right? So as an example, we had a team here this past Skull Games weekend that was wanting to participate in Skull Games. It was a small group in another state, and they were like, hey, we have law enforcement. They're here. They're ready. We're going to provide them intel. They're going to move forward. And I was like, cool, who are they? We're not providing intel to an agency that I haven't vetted. There's no way. Because what that means is, A, that the women could be taking our information and just getting locked up. They could be getting sexually abused. They God knows what could happen. And there's absolutely no way that we're going to send that without me having a conversation. What's your policies? What's your procedures? How does this work? How does that work? Luckily, I've been in the field long enough that I know quite a few people. And if I don't know you, like, I know somebody who does. So that's kind of quick. But yeah, we are not going to be sending information for that. The other is follow-up, right? Like, so we sent you these 5 data packets. What did you do with them?
Right.
Are you making arrests?
Get dusty on the desk somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. Because we don't want to do that. If that's the case, I don't want to pass info
Right.
to you. I want to pass it to somebody who's going to do something with it. But even that goes within the department, right? So you could say this department has A squad, B squad. A squad is phenomenal. B squad is not. So it's like, hey, we need to wait for A squad to come back on duty, and I'll funnel it straight to them, because if I send it to B squad, there's going to be some problems. So,
right.
Let's get it to A. And then the other side is just the training of law enforcement. So getting them up to speed on kind of what the best practices are. That way, when it does come time where we're like, here, we're filtering you information, I already know who you are, and I know what your practices are, and I know what you're going to do with it.
Kind of brings up something that we talked about earlier, and that's that ego. Do you run into egos being an outside agency now, trying to work with these law enforcement agencies to?
No, not any more than what it's ever really been. I don't really deal with a bunch of ego. I had somebody from a large department a couple of years ago refer to me as the godfather of human trafficking. So it's like, do I always agree, and do people always agree with me? No, of course not, right? But 90% of the time we can hang that up and actually get to work and find that common ground. But we do have egos. I'm not going to say we don't. They're very large. They're very, very large.
Well, that's good that they're able to take that help, right? Because there's plenty of work in this arena to go around.
There is. And I think a lot of it comes back to, and again, this is just 10 years worth of experience, right? So what are all the arguments? I already know the arguments walking into it. A, we need to arrest the victim so that she's safe tonight, because if she's in jail, she's not being trafficked. And I'm like, cool. If that's the case, then let's go arrest the domestic violence and sexual assault victims so we can make sure they're safe. And you watch the head spin, right? They're like, oh, well, we can't do that. I'm like, then why are we doing this? I had one person, and this one's pretty common. Well, I arrested so-and-so, and she told me that had I not arrested her, she would be dead. So I saved her life. And I'm like, great. 0.1.5% of the time it worked. 100% of the time, the other 99.5% of the time it's not working. So why are we focused on that? It's just walking in knowing what the arguments are going to be ahead of time. And the other big one is culture, right? I love culture. I don't care what country you're in, you don't understand our culture. And I'm like, but you don't understand LA versus New York versus Central Texas. We have our own cultures. It's all the same. Trafficking is trafficking. Like,
culture is a word that gets thrown around a lot to just confuse 100%. People.
Confuse or justify. I think a lot of times, like, how do I justify this? Oh, it's our culture. Like, no, I don't think that. Does it make it right? Like,
I always like asking people, what is your culture?
Yeah.
Define it.
Good luck.
If you can't define it, it's not there.
Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah. That second point too, right? I mean, about being arrested, save their life. If we are partnered with good agencies that can get them to a safe environment without arrest, I mean, that's another avenue. It's not, you have to arrest them to.
It is. You find here's what happens with that. You find one cop that hangs his hat on that because, again, one guy in particular told me she'd be dead. I was like, cool. How many women have you arrested for prostitution in your career? Oh, a couple hundred. A couple hundred. So one of a couple hundred told you this, right? You're literally going to hang your hat on that? Yeah. I was like, dude, let's go gamble because I'll gamble against you all day long. Like, I'm totally in. That's always the big one. And again, just knowing what agencies are doing what, and it's not that difficult to figure out.
Well, this has been an awesome conversation, Joe. Just kind of wrap this up here. Where can everybody find Skull Games at? And, how could they volunteer?
How do we do that? Go to skullgames.io. There's volunteer opportunities on there. There's obviously opportunities to donate. We are a 501c3. We live on donations. So definitely encourage you to do that if you can't come and hunt. Our backgrounds are on there. If there's anything you want to see, definitely reach out. We can add it on there. There's some matrix on there. There's a new Protect Your Family video series that Jeff put on recently. Lots of good info there.
Awesome mission. If you guys come to Kansas City, by all means, give me a call. I would love to participate. So
absolutely.
I'm finding the more that I have to do in this sector, or the more people that I meet in the sector is a better way to put it, the more I realize how awesome these people are, right? The survivors, the people that are out there on the front lines, everybody who I deal with is just completely amazing. So being part of that would be phenomenal. So give me a ring.
For sure.
Other than that, Joe, really appreciate you being on tonight. And let's go out there and catch some bad guys, man.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
You have just experienced the heat and pressure of the Forge. Remember, words without action are meaningless. Now, after the heat of the Forge, shape your thoughts, quench your brain, then put your new tools to use, adding to your leadership. Tune in next week for more lessons from the Forge.